On a freezing night in the Colorado mountains, a retired Navy SEAL and his loyal German Shepherd believe they are simply heading home. But at an abandoned roadside shelter, an elderly woman sits alone in the snow, clutching a wooden box that holds a secret. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and how this moment makes you feel.
You're here.
Then like and subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories that remind us kindness still matters. On a bitter winter evening, high in the Colorado mountains, where the wind carved restless paths through snow-covered pines and the sky hung low and heavy with storm clouds, the world seemed quieter than it should have been, as if the wilderness itself were holding its breath beneath the falling snow and along a narrow, winding road that cut through the frozen landscape. A single pickup truck moved slowly forward, its headlights slicing through the swirling white darkness. Inside sat Daniel Carter, a 42-year-old former Navy SEAL, a man whose strength was not immediately loud but deeply rooted. Built from years of discipline, loss, and survival, he was tall, just over 6 feet, with a lean, hardened frame shaped more by endurance than appearance. His shoulders broad but not bulky, his movements controlled and efficient. His face angular with a square jaw and faint lines etched around his eyes, the kind that came from years of watching horizons for danger. His dark brown hair was kept short in a practical cut, slightly longer than regulation now that he was no longer in service, and his eyes, a muted steel gray, carried a calm alertness that rarely faded, even here, even now. Though beneath that calm there was something unsettled, something hollow that had taken root since the day his career ended. A torn ligament during what should have been a routine training exercise had quietly closed the door on everything he had built his life around. And though the doctors had called it manageable, the military had called it final. And so Daniel Carter had returned home to a place that no longer felt like one. Beside him sat Max, a 6-year-old German Shepherd, large and imposing even for his breed, with a thick black and tan coat that glistened faintly under the dashboard lights. His chest broad, his posture balanced with the quiet readiness of a trained working dog, Max's ears stood upright even when he appeared relaxed, and his amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, as if he were constantly evaluating the world rather than simply moving through it. The two had served together overseas, bonded through situations where hesitation could mean death, and since leaving the service, Max had remained the only constant presence in Daniel's life, the only one who seemed to understand the silence that followed him. Inside the truck, the air smelled faintly of leather, cold air, and dog fur. The heater hummed softly but struggled against the biting cold outside, and for several miles neither of them made a sound. The rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers marking the passage of time, Daniel's gloved hand rested loosely on the steering wheel, though his grip tightened slightly whenever the tires slipped against the icy road. He should have felt relief driving away from the base for the last time, should have felt freedom in the open road, but instead there was only a quiet disconnection, as if he had stepped out of a life that had defined him and into one that had yet to take shape. He had not returned to his father's cabin in years, not since the old man passed. The memory of that place lingered somewhere between comfort and avoidance. His father, Robert Carter, had been a man of few words, a veteran himself, hardened by a different war but carrying similar silences. Their relationship had never been easy, built more on mutual respect than affection. And when Robert died, Daniel had stayed away, telling himself there was nothing left there for him. The road curved sharply ahead, and Max suddenly lifted his head, his ears snapping forward with immediate focus. Daniel noticed instantly Max was not a reactive dog. He did not respond without reason. "What is it?" Daniel muttered, his voice low, but Max did not look at him. Instead, the dog leaned slightly toward the passenger window, his body tense, a low rumble vibrating quietly in his chest. Not quite a growl, but close. Daniel eased his foot off the accelerator, the truck slowing as he followed Max's line of sight. At first, there was nothing but the storm, snow moving in chaotic waves across the road. Then, through the blur of white, he saw it. A faint, flickering light ahead, yellow and unstable, like an old street lamp struggling to stay alive.
Something's wrong.
As they drew closer, the shape beneath the light began to form. A small roadside structure, barely more than a wooden bench beneath a weathered roof, the remains of an abandoned bus stop. Daniel frowned slightly. He knew this road, had driven it years ago. The route had been discontinued long before. No buses had stopped here in nearly a decade. And yet beneath that dim, trembling light, someone was sitting there. The figure was small, motionless, almost blending into the storm. Max shifted again, his front paws pressing lightly against the door. Daniel slowed the truck to a near stop, the headlights illuminating the scene more clearly now. An elderly woman sat on the bench, her posture straight despite the storm, her frame slight but composed. She appeared to be in her late 70s, her silver hair pulled back neatly into a low bun, though loose strands clung damply to her temples. Her skin pale and lined with age, but not frail. There was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself. She wore a long, dark winter coat, now dusted heavily with snow, and in her lap she clutched a small wooden box, its surface worn and aged, as if it had traveled far more years than she had intended. Daniel's instincts sharpened instantly. Something about the scene felt wrong, deeply wrong. He pulled the truck to the side of the road, the engine idling softly as he reached for the door handle. Max was already moving. The moment the door opened, the dog leapt down into the snow, landing with controlled precision. He did not rush forward. Instead, he approached slowly, each step deliberate, assessing. Daniel followed, the cold air biting immediately through his jacket, snow soaking into his boots within seconds. As he stepped closer, the woman lifted her head, her eyes a pale, faded blue that seemed to reflect more memory than fear. She did not look startled, only tired, profoundly tired. Max reached her first, stopping a few feet away, his posture lowered slightly. Then, after a moment, he stepped closer and gently sniffed the air around her. His body language relaxed. No tension, no aggression. Finally, he lowered his head and rested his muzzle lightly against her knee. Daniel paused. That alone was enough to unsettle him. Max did not trust easily. "Ma'am," Daniel said, his voice steady but softened by concern, "are you all right out here?" The woman blinked slowly, her hands tightening slightly around the wooden box. "I believe so," she replied, her voice soft but clear. Carrying the calm tone of someone who had endured far more than a storm, Daniel glanced briefly down the road behind him. Something caught his attention. Through the snowfall, far in the distance, a pair of red taillights flickered briefly before disappearing around a bend. A vehicle leaving, the realization settled quietly in his chest. Whoever had brought her here was not coming back. He looked at her again, then at the empty road, then back at Max, who had not moved from her side. Daniel exhaled slowly, the decision forming before he fully acknowledged it. "You shouldn't stay out here," he said gently. "It's too cold. Come with me. I'll get you somewhere warm." The woman hesitated, her gaze drifting once more toward the road as if expecting something to return. But the storm swallowed everything behind them. After a long moment, she gave a small nod, and Daniel knew, without needing to hear it spoken, that whatever had happened before this moment, it had ended the second that car drove away. The storm did not loosen its grip as Daniel guided the truck off the main road and onto a narrower path that disappeared into the dense pine forest. The tires crunching over packed snow and ice as the vehicle climbed slightly toward a ridge where the trees opened just enough to reveal a small wooden cabin set back from the road. Its structure simple but sturdy, built decades earlier with thick timber and practical intention rather than beauty. A single porch light glowed faintly through the falling snow, casting a warm circle onto the ground that seemed almost out of place in the cold vastness surrounding it. Daniel slowed the truck and pulled to a stop, the engine idling for a moment before he turned it off. the sudden quiet of the mountains settling in around them. Broken only by the wind brushing through the branches above, he stepped out first. His boots sinking slightly into the snow, then moved quickly to the passenger side and opened the door. Max jumped down immediately, shaking the snow from his coat before turning back toward the woman as if to make sure she followed. Helen Brooks stepped down more slowly, her movements careful but controlled. She held the wooden box close against her chest, her posture still upright despite the cold. The porch light illuminated her face more clearly now, revealing the fine lines of age that traced across her pale skin, but also something steadier beneath them. A composure that suggested she had spent much of her life maintaining calm in difficult circumstances. Daniel gestured toward the cabin. "It's not much, but it's warm," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet reassurance he had used countless times in the past. Helen nodded gently without speaking, her eyes drifting briefly across the property as if taking in more than just what stood in front of her. Max walked ahead of them, his pace steady and confident, as though he had already accepted her presence as something natural. Daniel noticed that again, and it unsettled him more than he expected. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer, carrying the faint scent of old wood, coffee, and something older still, something that lingered in places where memories had settled into the walls. Daniel stepped in first and flicked on a lamp near the doorway. Soft, yellow light filled the room, revealing a modest living space. A stone fireplace along one wall, a worn leather chair beside it, and shelves lined with books and small objects collected over years. Helen stepped inside slowly, her boots leaving faint traces of melted snow on the wooden floor. She paused just past the doorway, her gaze moving across the room with deliberate attention. Not the curious glance of a guest, but something closer to recognition. Daniel set his keys down on a small table near the entrance, watching her quietly. "You can sit," he said, nodding toward the chair. But she did not move immediately. Instead, she took a few steps further into the room, her eyes lingering on the shelves, the furniture, the layout itself. Max moved to her side and sat beside her without being told, his body relaxed but alert. As if standing watch, Helen lowered one hand and rested it gently against the dog's head, her fingers brushing through the thick fur with familiarity that did not seem forced. Daniel frowned slightly. That made twice now. Max did not offer that kind of trust without reason. "He seems to like you," Daniel said, more to himself than to her. Helen gave a faint smile, the kind that carried more memory than amusement. "Animals remember things we don't always understand," she replied softly, her voice steady but distant. Daniel did not respond, but something about her words settled uneasily in his thoughts. He moved past her into the kitchen area, setting a kettle on the stove out of habit, the small routine grounding him as he worked, while Helen continued to stand in the living room, her attention now drawn toward a wall where several framed photographs hung in quiet arrangement. She stepped closer, her movement slow but purposeful. The light caught the frames as she approached, revealing images of men in uniform, candid moments, and one larger photograph near the center. Daniel noticed where she stopped. It was the photograph of his father, Robert Carter, taken years earlier, standing beside a group of soldiers in desert fatigues. His expression serious but not unkind, his posture strong despite the fatigue that had marked his later years. Helen's hand trembled slightly as she lifted it toward the frame, but did not touch it. Her breath caught almost imperceptibly. Max shifted closer beside her, his gaze following hers. Daniel watched from the kitchen doorway. Something in the room had changed. Something subtle, but undeniable. "You recognize him?" Daniel asked quietly. Helen did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the photograph, as if searching through layers of time rather than simply looking at an image. After a moment, she lowered her hand slowly. "He reminds me of someone," she said, though the words felt incomplete even as she spoke them. Daniel studied her face. There was something there now that had not been present before. Not just recognition, but something deeper. something that reached beyond coincidence, he leaned slightly against the doorframe, his arms folding loosely across his chest. "My father," he said, his voice neutral but carrying a quiet weight. Helen nodded faintly, still looking at the photograph. "He was a soldier," she said, not as a question, but as a confirmation. Daniel gave a small nod. "Iraq," he replied.
I needed to see it with my own
Helen's
eyes.
eyes softened slightly, though the expression did not fully reach her lips. "I spent time around soldiers," she murmured, her tone reflective. As if speaking more to herself than to him, Daniel tilted his head slightly. Something about the way she spoke felt practiced, familiar.
Let us help you.
"How long were you out here tonight?" he asked, shifting the conversation gently. Helen finally turned away from the photograph, her gaze moving back toward the room. "Long enough," she answered simply. Daniel did not press. The kettle began to hum softly behind him, and he turned to finish preparing the tea, though his thoughts remained on her, on the way she had looked at that photograph, on the way Max had stayed at her side without hesitation. When he returned to the living room with 2 cups, Helen had finally taken a seat, though her posture remained straight, the wooden box resting carefully in her lap. Max lay beside her now, his head resting lightly against her leg. As if he had chosen that place deliberately, Daniel handed her a cup. She accepted it with both hands, her fingers steady despite their thinness. For several moments they sat in silence, the storm continuing outside, the wind pressing faintly against the walls of the cabin, but inside, the air felt different, less empty than it had before. Helen's gaze drifted once more toward the photograph, then back to the room. "This place," she said slowly, "feels like it has been waiting." Daniel looked at her, the words settling somewhere deeper than he expected. He did not respond, but for the first time since he had stepped into the cabin, he found himself wondering not whether she belonged here, but how long she might have been connected to it before either of them understood why. Morning arrived quietly over the Colorado mountains, the storm having passed sometime before dawn, leaving behind a pale silver landscape where frost clung to every branch and the sky stretched clear and cold above the forest. Sunlight filtered gently through the tall pines and slipped across the windows of the cabin, illuminating the interior with a soft, diffused glow that felt unfamiliar to the space after so many months of silence. Daniel Carter woke earlier than he expected, his body still trained to rise with purpose even when none was required. For a moment he lay still, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the cabin adjusting to the morning cold. Then he remembered. Helen was here. The thought settled into his mind with a strange weight, not discomfort exactly, but something closer to unease shaped by curiosity. He pushed himself up and swung his legs over the side of the bed, the floorboards cool beneath his feet as he stepped into the hallway. The scent reached him first. Coffee, fresh, strong, and unmistakably recent. Daniel paused, his brow tightening slightly. He had not set the coffee maker the night before, and he knew for certain he had not told Helen where anything was kept. He moved forward quietly, his steps measured. When he reached the kitchen doorway, the sight that met him stopped him just short of entering. Helen Brooks stood by the stove, her back straight, her movements slow but precise. She wore the same dark cardigan from the night before, now dry and neatly arranged, her silver hair once again gathered into a clean, deliberate bun, and in her hands she held a kettle, pouring coffee into 2 mugs as if she had done so in this kitchen countless times before. Beside her, Max sat calmly, his large frame relaxed, his tail resting loosely against the floor. The dog glanced briefly toward Daniel, but did not move from his position, as though he had already accepted that this scene required no alert. Daniel leaned lightly against the doorframe, studying the details, the way Helen moved without hesitation, the way she reached for the cupboard to retrieve a second mug without searching, the way she placed the spoon exactly where it had always been kept. "I didn't show you where anything was," Daniel said finally. His voice calm but edged with quiet confusion. Helen turned slowly, offering a small, composed smile. "You didn't need to," she replied, her tone gentle. As if the answer were obvious, Daniel stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the countertop, the cabinet doors. Everything was in its place, nothing disturbed, yet something had shifted. "How did you know?" he asked, not accusing but needing to understand. Helen placed one of the mugs in front of him, her hands steady despite their age. "Some places," she said softly, "leave an impression on people, even after many years." Daniel watched her carefully. The explanation felt incomplete, but he could not dismiss the calm certainty in her voice. Max rose from his spot and moved closer to her. Brushing lightly against her side before settling again at her feet, the movement was subtle but deliberate. As if reaffirming his position beside her, Daniel exhaled slowly and took the mug, the warmth grounding him as he leaned back slightly against the counter, his mind already working through possibilities that refused to settle into anything logical. Helen turned back toward the stove and adjusted the heat beneath a small pan. Daniel hadn't even noticed she had begun preparing food. Eggs, he realized after a moment, the smell rising faintly into the air. "You don't have to do that," he said, though there was less insistence in his voice now. Helen shook her head lightly. "I've spent most of my life doing things like this," she replied. "It feels natural." Daniel studied her profile. There was something in the way she spoke, not just familiarity, but habit shaped over years. "You were a nurse," he said, recalling fragments from the night before. Helen paused briefly, then nodded once. "A long time ago," she answered, her voice carrying a quiet distance. Daniel did not press further, but the pieces in his mind continued to shift. After a few minutes, they sat at the table together. The meal simple but prepared with care. Max positioned himself between them, his head resting lightly against Helen's leg. Daniel watched that again. The unwavering closeness, the absence of hesitation. It did not make sense. Max had worked with him in environments where trust was earned through time and proof, yet here, with a woman they had met only hours ago, the dog behaved as though she were already known. "He doesn't usually do that," Daniel said quietly. Helen glanced down at the dog, her fingers brushing gently through his fur. "Perhaps he remembers something," she replied. Daniel frowned slightly. "Remembers what?" Helen did not answer directly. Instead, she looked toward the window, where the forest stretched wide and still beneath the morning light. "There are things," she said after a moment, "that don't always belong to the present." Daniel felt a faint tension settle in his chest. Not fear, but the kind of unease that came when something almost made sense, but not quite. After breakfast, Helen stood and began clearing the dishes without being asked, her movements efficient, practiced. She placed each item exactly where it belonged, even the ones Daniel himself sometimes misplaced. He followed her into the living room, watching as she paused again in front of the photographs. This time, her gaze moved more slowly across them, lingering not just on his father's image, but on the others. Men in uniform, faces frozen in time. "He wasn't the only one who came here, was he?" she asked quietly. Daniel shook his head slightly. "My father had people over sometimes," he said. "Old friends, guys he served with." Helen nodded faintly, as if confirming something to herself. "Yes," she murmured. "I thought so." Daniel stepped closer, his attention sharpening. "You thought so?" he repeated. Helen turned toward him, her expression calm but carrying something deeper beneath it, something unresolved. "This house," she said slowly, "has seen a lot of soldiers pass through." Daniel studied her face. The certainty in her voice left little room for coincidence. "You talk like you were one of them," he said, not accusing, but searching. Helen's lips curved into a faint, almost distant smile. "Not a soldier," she replied. But I knew many. The room fell quiet again, the air thick with questions that had not yet found their answers. Max shifted slightly, pressing closer against Helen's leg, his tail brushing lightly against the floor as if grounding her in the present. Daniel glanced at the dog, then back at her. The feeling returned, stronger now, that this moment was not random, that something had been moving quietly beneath the surface long before he noticed it. Helen's gaze drifted once more around the room, then back to Daniel, and after a long pause, she spoke the words that settled everything into a deeper uncertainty. I think, she said softly, I have been here before, a very long time ago. Daniel did not respond immediately. He simply stood there, watching her, as the weight of that possibility began to take shape in his mind. Not yet understood, but no longer dismissible. The late morning light stretched pale and quiet across the mountain road as Daniel Carter guided his truck down from the ridge. The snow from the night before still packed thick along the edges of the asphalt. Though the center had begun to clear under the weak winter sun, the air felt sharper now, cleaner, as if the storm had stripped something away and left only what mattered behind. Max sat upright in the passenger seat, his posture alert but calm, his gaze fixed forward as the truck moved steadily toward the small town nestled at the base of the mountains. Daniel drove with one hand resting loosely on the wheel, the other tapping lightly against the gear shift, his mind occupied with the same thought that had followed him since morning. Helen Brooks, the way she had moved through the cabin, the way she had looked at his father's photograph, the way Max had accepted her without question. None of it aligned with coincidence, and Daniel was not a man who believed in coincidence. Not after everything he had seen. The town appeared gradually through the trees, a modest cluster of buildings set along a narrow main street, most of them low and practical, their paint worn by years of harsh weather. A diner with a flickering neon sign, a hardware store with a sagging awning, and at the far end, a brick building that housed the sheriff's office. Daniel pulled into the gravel lot and cut the engine, the silence settling around him again. Max shifted slightly but remained seated, waiting. Daniel stepped out, the cold air biting against his face as he walked toward the entrance. Inside, the office carried the familiar scent of coffee and old paper, a quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Behind the front desk stood a man who looked as though he had been part of the building longer than the furniture itself. Sheriff Tom Reynolds was in his early 60s, tall, with a broad, weathered frame that had softened slightly with age, but still carried the strength of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. His face was lined deeply, the skin tanned and roughened by years under the sun. A thick gray mustache framed his mouth, and his eyes, a steady dark brown, held the kind of patience that came from seeing the same kinds of problems repeat themselves over time. He wore a brown sheriff's jacket over a faded plaid shirt, the badge pinned neatly to his chest, and when he looked up and saw Daniel, his expression shifted into something that resembled both recognition and mild surprise. "Well, I'll be," Reynolds said, his voice carrying a low, steady drawl. "Daniel Carter." Daniel gave a small nod as he approached the desk. "Morning, Sheriff." Reynolds stepped around the counter and extended a hand, his grip firm, practiced. "Haven't seen you in a while," he said, studying Daniel's face for a moment longer than necessary, as if measuring something unspoken. "Heard you were back." Daniel shrugged slightly. "Just passing through," he replied, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Reynolds glanced past him briefly, noticing Max standing just inside the doorway, the dog's posture composed but watchful. "That yours?" he asked, nodding toward the German shepherd. Daniel looked back. "Yeah, Max." Reynolds gave an approving nod. "Good stance," he said. "You can tell a lot about a dog by the way it holds itself." Daniel allowed a faint smile at that. Then his expression settled again. "I came to ask about someone," he said, his tone shifting to something more focused. Reynolds leaned back slightly against the desk, folding his arms. "All right," he replied. "Who are we talking about?" Daniel hesitated only briefly before answering. "Helen Brooks." The name seemed to settle into the room with more weight than Daniel expected. Reynolds did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition. "Brooks," he repeated slowly, as if testing the sound of it against memory. Daniel watched him closely.
We've been waiting for you,
"You know the
Helen.
name?" he asked. Reynolds
dear.
exhaled quietly, then turned and walked toward a filing cabinet along the wall, pulling open one of the drawers and flipping through a series of folders with deliberate care. The sound of paper shifting filled the silence between them.
Ready your weapon.
After a moment, he closed the drawer again without retrieving anything. "Small towns remember things," Reynolds said finally, turning back toward Daniel. "Even when people don't." Daniel frowned slightly.
Max,
"What does that mean?"
what is it? Did you
Reynolds
hear that?
studied him for a moment,
Feeling here.
then gestured toward a chair near the desk.
Daniel Carter.
"Sit," he
Oh,
said.
you're in there.
Daniel remained standing, but his attention sharpened. Reynolds nodded once, as if expecting that, then continued. "Your father ever talked to you about his time overseas?" Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "Not much," he replied. Reynolds gave a faint, knowing smile. "Most of them didn't," he said. "But every now and then they'd let something slip." Daniel felt something shift in his chest. "What are you getting at?" he asked. Reynolds leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the desk. "Your father mentioned a woman once," he said. "A nurse." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "A nurse?" Reynolds nodded. "Said she was the reason half his unit made it out of there alive." Daniel's breath slowed, his mind already beginning to connect pieces he had not known existed. "Did he ever say her name?" he asked. Reynolds paused, just long enough to make the moment heavier, then answered,
I have
"Brooks."
something for you.
Daniel stood very still, the words settling into place with a
Helen?
clarity that felt almost inevitable.
Recognize them?
"Helen
Yes.
Brooks?" he asked, his voice quieter now.
Helen?
Reynolds gave a small shrug.
I see you here.
"Could be," he said.
Michael.
"Names stick around here longer than people expect." Daniel ran a hand across the back of his neck, his thoughts moving quickly now. The image of Helen in the cabin, the way she had looked at the photograph, the way she had spoken about soldiers. Why would she be here, he asked, more to himself than to Reynolds. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "People go back to places that matter,"
Keep watching.
he said simply. Daniel glanced toward the door, where Max still stood, the dog watching him with quiet focus as if waiting for the next decision.
Easy.
She was at an abandoned stop, Daniel said slowly. "In the middle of a storm."
Michael.
Reynolds nodded once. "Then I'd say she was looking for
So good to see
something."
you.
Daniel looked back at him. "Or someone,"
Neither did
Reynolds
I.
added. Daniel felt the weight of that settle deeper. The possibility no longer distant, no longer uncertain, but forming into something real, something that reached back further than he had ever
Told you
considered.
it would come to this.
Reynolds straightened and adjusted his jacket. "If it's the same woman your father talked about," he said,
Be here. Stay back.
"then you might want to listen to what she has to say." Daniel nodded once, the decision already made before he turned toward the door. Max moved immediately, falling into step
know,
beside him without needing to be
What
called.
else could I do?
As Daniel stepped back into the cold air outside,
Keep him close,
the
Helen.
mountain road stretching out
I can hear
ahead,
them coming.
he realized that whatever had brought Helen Brooks to his cabin, it was not chance, and whatever she carried with her, it was connected to a part of his father's life he had never truly known. The afternoon settled into a quiet stillness over the mountains as Daniel drove back towards the cabin. The sky pale and stretched thin above the endless rows of pine trees. Though the storm had passed, the cold remained sharp. Clinging to the air and pressing lightly against the windows of the truck, Max sat beside him, his posture alert as always, but there was a subtle tension in the way his ears shifted at distant sounds, as if something unseen had already begun to approach. Daniel's thoughts remained fixed on the conversation with Sheriff Reynolds. The name, Helen Brooks, repeating in his mind with growing weight. The idea that she had been connected to his father's past no longer felt distant or abstract. It felt immediate, personal, and unfinished. When the cabin finally came into view through the trees, something was different. Even before the truck came to a full stop, Daniel noticed the second vehicle parked near the front. A dark gray SUV, newer than anything usually seen on this road. Its surface still clean despite the weather. Its presence sharp and deliberate against the quiet landscape. Max reacted instantly, his body stiffening. A low, controlled growl forming in his chest as his eyes fixed on the unfamiliar vehicle. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. "Easy," he muttered.
Where did you get this?
Though his own instincts had already shifted,
Gave this to you?
he stepped out of the truck slowly, scanning the area. The snow around the SUV was freshly disturbed, footprints leading toward the cabin door. Not rushed, but purposeful. Max moved ahead of him, his posture lowered, muscles coiled with restrained readiness. Daniel followed closely, his senses sharpening with each step. As he reached the porch, the door opened before he could touch it, revealing a man standing just inside. The man was in his early 50s, slightly shorter than Daniel, but with a thicker build. His body carried the softness of someone who had spent more time behind desks than in physical work, though there was still a trace of strength in his shoulders. His face was rounder, clean-shaven, with a slightly flushed complexion. His thinning brown hair combed neatly to the side in an attempt to maintain order. His eyes, a pale blue, held a flicker of impatience beneath a surface of forced politeness. He wore a dark overcoat over a button-down shirt, the kind of clothing chosen more for appearance than practicality in this environment. "You must be Daniel," the man said, his voice controlled but carrying a faint edge. Daniel stopped just short of the doorway, his gaze steady. "That's right," he replied. Max stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Daniel and the man, his low growl returning. More pronounced now, the man glanced down at the dog, his expression tightening briefly before smoothing again. "Michael Brooks," he said, extending a hand that Daniel did not immediately take, "Helen's son." The words landed with quiet confirmation. Daniel's eyes shifted past him into the cabin. Helen sat in the same chair as before, her posture composed, the wooden box still resting in her lap, but there was something different in her expression now. Something guarded, something distant. Daniel stepped inside, ignoring the outstretched hand. Max moved with him, his presence firm, unyielding. Another figure stood near the window. A woman in her late 40s, slender with sharp features and dark blonde hair pulled tightly into a low ponytail. Her posture upright and rigid, her arms crossed lightly over her chest, her clothing neat but understated. A gray coat over a black sweater. Her face carried a practiced neutrality. But her eyes, cool and calculating, moved quickly between Daniel, Max, and Helen. "This is my sister Laura," Michael added, gesturing briefly. Laura gave a small nod, her expression unchanged. Daniel acknowledged her with a glance before turning his attention fully to Helen. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. Helen looked at him, her gaze steady but quieter than before. "They came to take me home," she said, the simplicity of the statement masking the tension beneath it. Daniel straightened slightly, his eyes returning to Michael. "Home?" he repeated. Michael sighed lightly, as if the situation were more inconvenient than serious. "We've been looking for her," he said, his tone measured. "She wandered off during the storm." Daniel's expression did not change. "Wandered?" he asked. Michael hesitated just enough to reveal uncertainty, then continued. "She's not supposed to be out alone," he added. "We have arrangements for her care." Laura stepped forward slightly, her voice calm but firmer than Michael's. "A facility," she clarified. "Somewhere she can be looked after properly." Daniel glanced back at Helen. Her hands tightened slightly around the wooden box, but she said nothing. Max moved closer to her, his body pressing lightly against her leg, his eyes fixed on Michael and Laura with quiet intensity. Daniel turned back, his voice lower now. "She didn't seem lost when I found her," he said. Michael exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "With all due respect," he replied, "you don't know her situation." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "Then explain it," he said. Laura stepped in again, her tone controlled. "Our mother has not been entirely reliable," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "She's been forgetting things, making decisions that aren't safe." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "And leaving her at a bus stop in the middle of a storm was safe?"
Daniel?
The question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Michael's expression hardened. "That's not what happened," he said quickly, but the lack of detail in his response spoke louder than the words themselves. Helen finally spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "They didn't mean for me to stay," she said. Though the hesitation that followed suggested otherwise, Max's growl deepened, his body shifting slightly forward, placing himself more directly between Helen and her children, his stance unmistakably protective now. Laura's eyes flickered briefly with irritation. "Control your dog," she said, her tone cool. Daniel did not move. "He's under control," he replied evenly. Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustration beginning to surface. "Look," he said, "this doesn't need to be complicated. We're taking her back where she belongs." Daniel's gaze hardened slightly. "Where she belongs,"
You need to leave,
he repeated quietly, his eyes drifting once more to Helen, who sat silently, her grip on the wooden box tightening just enough to reveal her unease. Max let out a low, unmistakable growl, stepping fully in front of her now, his body rigid, his presence a clear barrier. And in that moment, the decision in the room no longer belonged solely to words. It had shifted into something deeper, something instinctive, something that neither Michael nor Laura fully understood. The tension in the cabin did not break all at once. It stretched, tightened, and held as if the room itself had decided to wait and see who would move first. The late afternoon light had begun to dim, casting longer shadows across the wooden floor, and the warmth from the fireplace no longer felt entirely comforting. Daniel Carter stood a few steps from Helen's chair, his posture calm but unyielding. Max remained planted directly in front of her, his body forming a clear barrier between her and the two figures near the door, his ears forward, muscles tight beneath his thick coat, his low growl steady and deliberate, not reckless, not uncontrolled, but precise, a warning rather than a threat. Michael Brooks shifted his weight uneasily, glancing between the dog and Daniel, his earlier composure beginning to crack under the pressure of the moment. Laura Brooks remained more composed, though her arms had tightened across her chest, her jaw set in quiet irritation. "This is getting unnecessary," she said, her voice controlled but sharper now. Daniel did not look at her, his attention fixed on Helen, on the way her hands held the wooden box, not loosely, but with quiet insistence, as if it mattered more than anything else in the room. "What's in the box?" Daniel asked, his tone even, but carrying a weight that made the question more than casual curiosity. Helen hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges of the worn wood. The box itself was small, no larger than a hardcover book, its surface marked by age, scratches, and faded varnish telling a story of time and travel. It was not decorative, it was kept, preserved. "It's nothing important," Michael answered quickly before Helen could speak, stepping forward just enough to insert himself into the moment. Daniel's eyes shifted to him slowly, the silence that followed heavier than any direct challenge. "She can answer for herself," Daniel said quietly. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. the tension in his face revealing more than his words had. "It's personal," he insisted, but the firmness in his voice felt forced. Daniel looked back at Helen. "Is it?" he asked. Helen's gaze moved from Daniel to her son, then back again. Something conflicted passed through her expression. Not fear, but hesitation born from years of holding something close.
It's from him.
Max shifted slightly, his head tilting just enough to bring his nose closer to the box, his nostrils flaring faintly as he caught a scent that seemed to draw his focus entirely. The dog's growl softened, not disappearing but changing, becoming something more intent, more curious. Daniel noticed that immediately Max was not reacting to the people anymore. He was reacting to the box. "Max," Daniel said quietly. The dog did not look at him. His attention locked onto the object in Helen's hands, his body leaning forward just slightly, as if pulled by something he could not ignore.
Don't worry, I won't let you.
Laura's eyes narrowed. "That dog needs to be removed," she said sharply. Daniel ignored her, his gaze returning to Helen. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the box. Helen looked down at it, her hands resting still for a long moment, the room holding its breath again. Then, slowly, carefully, she extended it toward him. Michael stepped forward immediately, his hand reaching out. "No," he said, his voice breaking the quiet with sudden urgency. Daniel's movement was faster, his hand closing gently but firmly around the box before Michael could take it. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not aggression, but recognition. Daniel had seen that kind of reaction before, in men who knew more than they were willing to admit. Michael stepped back slightly, his jaw tightening, his composure slipping further. "You don't understand what that is," he said. Daniel's grip on the box remained steady. "Then explain it," he replied. Michael hesitated, just long enough for the truth to show itself in the silence. Laura glanced at her brother, then back at Daniel, her expression colder now. "It's old," she said.
Daniel,
"Nothing that concerns
this is for you.
Daniel did not respond. Instead, he lowered his gaze to the box,
See this.
his fingers tracing lightly along the edge where the lid met the base. The wood felt solid, worn smooth in places where it had been handled repeatedly over time. He lifted the lid slowly, the hinges creaking softly in protest. Inside, the contents were simple,
Okay, dear.
but immediately carried weight. A folded letter, yellowed with age, and beneath it a photograph, black and white, slightly curled at the edges. Daniel reached in carefully, lifting the photograph first, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. It showed a group of soldiers standing together, their uniforms marked by dust and time, their expressions serious but alive. Among them, one face stood out instantly, unmistakable even in the faded image. Robert Carter, younger, stronger, his posture straight, his gaze steady. Daniel's breath slowed as he held the photograph closer, the room around him fading slightly as memory and realization began to align. "That's him," he said quietly. Not a question.
Not anymore.
Helen watched him, her expression softening with something that resembled both relief and sadness. Michael turned his head away slightly, his discomfort now impossible to hide. Daniel set the photograph aside carefully and picked up the letter, the paper fragile beneath his fingers, the ink faded but still legible. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the first line, and then stopping completely as the name at the top settled into place, Robert Carter. Daniel did not speak immediately, the weight of it pressing deeper than he had expected. His father's name, written decades earlier, in a hand that was not his own, but addressed to him all the same. He looked up at Helen, his voice quieter now. "This was meant for him," he said. Helen nodded faintly. "Yes," she replied. "It always was." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried something different, something clearer. The past was no longer distant, no longer uncertain. It was here, in Daniel's hands, And whatever story had been waiting inside that box, it had finally begun to reveal itself. The air inside the cabin seemed to settle into a deeper stillness after the letter was opened, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had just been revealed. Daniel Carter stood near the table, the paper still in his hand, his eyes moving slowly across the faded ink, as if reading it again might somehow change what it meant, but the name remained the same. Robert Carter, his father, written in a time long before Daniel had understood the man beyond the role he had played at home. Max had moved back to Helen's side, his body pressed lightly against her leg, his presence steady and grounding, the earlier tension in his posture now replaced by something quieter. Almost protective in a different way, Michael Brooks stood near the door, his shoulders slightly hunched now, his earlier insistence fading into something closer to resignation. While Laura remained still, her expression controlled but no longer entirely detached, the room had shifted, the conflict no longer about where Helen would go, but about what had been carried into this space without anyone fully understanding it until now. Daniel folded the letter carefully and set it back onto the table, his gaze lifting to Helen. "You knew him," he said, his voice low, not accusing, but searching. Helen met his eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was no hesitation in her expression, only a quiet acceptance. "Yes," she said softly, her hands resting gently over the wooden box. "I knew your father." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, the movement deliberate, as if grounding himself before asking what came next. "How?" he asked, the single word carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. Helen's gaze drifted briefly toward the photograph lying on the table, then beyond it, as if looking through something only she could see. When she spoke again, her voice carried a subtle change, not weaker, but layered with memory. "I was a nurse," she began, "during the Iraq War." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed. Helen continued, her tone steady but distant. "I worked with a forward medical unit. We were stationed close to active zones, closer than most people would have been comfortable with." Her fingers tightened slightly together, not from fear, but from the habit of recalling something that had never fully left her. "Your father's unit came through one night," she said. "They had taken heavy fire, multiple injuries, limited time." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, the image forming in his mind without needing details. Helen's eyes lowered slightly. "Your father wasn't the one who needed treatment that night," she added. "It was my husband." Daniel blinked once, the connection shifting, deepening. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. Helen nodded. "James Brooks," she said, the name spoken with a softness that had not been present before. "He was part of your father's team." Daniel sat back slightly, processing, while Helen continued, her voice gaining a steadier rhythm as the memory unfolded. "He was badly wounded, shrapnel injuries, severe blood loss. We didn't think he would make it through the night." Her gaze lifted again, meeting Daniel's. "But your father didn't leave him," she said. "He stayed, even when he was ordered to move on." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, a familiar echo of stubborn loyalty taking shape in the story. Helen gave a faint, almost distant smile. "He carried him," she said, "through terrain that no one should have been moving through under those conditions, brought him back to us when most would have made a different choice." Daniel exhaled slowly, the image of his father shifting, becoming something clearer, something fuller than the man he had known at home. "He saved his life," Daniel said, more as a realization than a question. Helen nodded once. "Yes," she replied. Then after a brief pause, she added, "But that wasn't the end of it." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Helen's gaze drifted toward the window, the light outside now fading toward an evening. "When we came home," she continued, "James wasn't the same." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. Daniel remained silent, listening. Helen's voice softened. He carried things back with him that couldn't be seen, she said. Things that stayed, even when everything else tried to move on.
It's addressed to me.
Daniel understood that without needing further explanation, he had seen it, lived alongside it in different forms. Helen clasped her hands together lightly.
After all this time.
There were nights he didn't sleep, she
Yes.
said. Days he barely spoke, moments when he didn't recognize where he was.
He's waiting for you.
Her voice remained steady, but her eyes held something that had not faded with time.
You've been such a good boy.
I didn't know how to help him,
Thank you,
she
Max.
admitted. Not in the way he needed. Daniel leaned forward slightly. And my father? He asked. Helen's expression softened again, this time with something warmer. He came back, she said simply. Daniel frowned slightly. Came back? Helen nodded. Not because he had to, she explained, but because he said he made a promise. Daniel felt something shift again, something that reached beyond duty, beyond obligation. Helen continued. He visited us again and again, she said. Sat with James when the nights were too heavy. Talked to him when no one else could reach him. Her voice carried a quiet strength now. He reminded him that he was still here. Daniel swallowed slowly. The weight of the story settling deeper, Helen looked directly at him, her eyes clear despite the years behind them. Your father didn't just save his life in that desert, she said. He helped him find his way back afterward. Daniel sat very still, the silence stretching between them, filled with something that felt both heavy and grounding at the same time. Helen's hands rested gently again on the wooden box, her voice lowering slightly, but not weakening. That's why I wrote the letter, she said, because I never found the words to say it in person.
Hello?
Daniel nodded
Helen,
slowly,
Can you hear me?
understanding beginning to take shape in a way that could not be undone. Helen's gaze softened once more, her voice carrying the quiet truth that had waited all these years to be spoken. He saved
I wish you were
us,
still here.
she said. Twice. Evening settled gently over the mountains, the last light of day fading into a muted blue that stretched across the snow-covered forest. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, its glow casting long, flickering shadows along the walls where memories seemed to live quietly between the frames and shelves. Daniel Carter remained seated at the table, the letter now resting in front of him, his fingers lightly touching its edges as if the fragile paper held more than words. Across from him, Helen Brooks sat with a calm that no longer felt distant but deeply rooted, as if the story she had just told had lifted a weight she had carried for years. Max lay beside her, his head resting across her feet, his breathing slow and steady, the tension that had filled the room earlier now replaced by something heavier but clearer. Michael Brooks stood near the doorway, his shoulders lowered slightly. The sharpness that had defined him earlier softened into something more uncertain,
Sorry, wrong address.
while Laura remained near the window, her posture still straight, but her expression no longer entirely guarded. Daniel looked up from the letter, his gaze steady. Why didn't you give this to him? He asked quietly. Helen's eyes moved toward the paper, her fingers tightening gently together. I tried, she said, her voice softer now, not fragile, but touched by something that had endured time. Daniel leaned back slightly, listening. Helen drew a slow breath. After James got better, after he found some peace again, I wrote it, she continued. I thought it would be simple. Find him. Say thank you. Close that chapter properly. Her lips curved faintly, but there was no real smile behind it. But life doesn't always move in straight lines. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on her.
My dearest
Helen continued,
James.
her voice steady but carrying the quiet weight of years. We moved, she said. James needed space, somewhere quieter, somewhere that didn't remind him of
My
everything he had
dearest
been
John.
through. So we left,
It's been so long.
and with that, I lost track of your
I miss you
father.
more every day.
Daniel nodded slightly, understanding the distance that could grow between people even when intentions remained. Helen's eyes lowered briefly. I kept the letter, she said. Told myself I would find him when things settled. She paused, her breath catching almost imperceptibly before continuing. But things never really settled. The fire shifted, sending a soft crack through the room as she spoke. Daniel watched her carefully. Helen lifted her gaze again. James passed away years later, she said. The words simple, but the meaning beneath them vast. Michael shifted slightly at the doorway, his expression tightening. While Laura's eyes dropped momentarily, Daniel felt the weight of that loss settle quietly. Helen's hands rested still in her lap. After that, she continued, it became harder to move forward, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know where forward was anymore. Daniel exhaled slowly, recognizing something in that. Something he had felt himself in different ways. Helen's voice remained steady but softer now. I stayed in the same place for a long time, she said, watching the years pass, telling myself I would try again tomorrow. She gave a faint, distant smile, but tomorrow has a way of becoming years if you let it. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly toward Michael, then back to her. Helen followed his glance, her expression changing slightly, not in anger, but in quiet acknowledgement. Michael did what he could, she said gently, but people grow in different directions. Michael looked down, his jaw tightening, but he did not interrupt. Helen continued, after James was gone, I think he saw me as something that needed to be managed rather than understood. Her tone held no bitterness, only clarity. Laura turned slightly away from the window, her expression less certain now. Daniel leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. And the letter, he asked. Helen nodded toward it. I kept it with me, she said, all these years. Not because I didn't want to let go, but because I never finished what I started. She paused, her gaze drifting towards the fire. It wasn't just about saying thank you, she added. It was about honoring what he did, making sure it wasn't forgotten. Daniel felt something shift deeper in his chest, something that connected the past to the present in a way he had not expected. Helen continued. A few months ago, I heard his name again, she said. Daniel looked up. Where? He asked. Helen gave a small shrug. From someone who had known him, she replied. Just a passing mention, but it was enough. Daniel nodded slowly, the pieces beginning to align. Helen's voice steadied again. So I decided I would find him, she said. No more waiting, no more excuses. She glanced around the cabin, her eyes softening slightly. I followed what little I could, records, names, places, until I reached this area. Daniel's breath slowed, the weight of her journey settling in. Helen's expression shifted again, this time with something closer to quiet regret. I didn't realize he was gone, she said, her voice softer now. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly. Then back to her, Helen clasped her hands together. By the time I found out, I was already here, she continued. And I thought maybe, just maybe, I could still leave the letter where it belonged. Daniel's eyes moved around the room, taking in the space differently now, as something more than just a cabin. Helen's voice grew quieter. But I didn't make it that far, she said. Michael shifted again, his discomfort visible. Daniel looked at him briefly, then back at Helen. What happened? He asked. Helen hesitated, then answered simply. They didn't think it was important, she said, her gaze flicking toward Michael and Laura, who both avoided her eyes. They said it was time to move on, that holding on to the past wouldn't change anything. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Helen continued. So they decided for me, she said, her tone calm but final, and I ended up at that stop before I could find this place. The room fell quiet again, the truth now clear, not hidden behind assumptions or partial explanations, but fully present. Daniel looked at the letter once more, then back at Helen, understanding settling into something steady, something that could not be ignored. Helen's gaze met his, her voice carrying the quiet conclusion of everything she had carried for so long. "I came all this way," she said softly, "and I was almost too late to finish what I started." Night settled heavily over the mountains, the kind of deep, quiet darkness that seemed to press gently against the cabin walls, while inside the fire had burned lower. Its glow dimmer now, but still steady, casting a warm pulse across the wooden floor. Daniel Carter remained standing near the table long after Helen had finished speaking, the weight of her story settling into him in a way that was both grounding and unsettling. Max lay at Helen's feet, but his eyes remained open, alert, occasionally shifting toward the corners of the room as if tracking something unseen. Michael and Laura had retreated slightly, their presence still in the cabin but no longer dominating it. Their voices quiet, their earlier certainty replaced by something closer to discomfort. Daniel exhaled slowly and ran a hand across the back of his neck, his gaze drifting across the room, across the photographs, the furniture, the small details he had long ignored. Everything felt different now, not changed physically, but understood differently, as if the cabin itself had been waiting for something to be acknowledged. He knew, Daniel murmured quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Helen looked up at him, her expression calm but attentive. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the far side of the room, his steps measured, his mind moving through fragments of memory he had not considered in years. His father sitting by the fire, speaking in half-finished sentences, mentioning people Daniel had never met, stories that had never fully been told. Daniel paused near the old bookshelf, his hand resting lightly against the wood. "He used to say something," Daniel said, his voice distant now, "about someone coming back." Helen's gaze sharpened slightly. "Coming back?" she repeated. Daniel nodded faintly. "I thought it was just something he said," he continued, "one of those things that didn't really mean anything at the time." Max shifted suddenly, his head lifting, his ears snapping forward with sharp focus, the change immediate and unmistakable. Daniel stopped mid-thought and turned towards the dog. Max rose slowly, his posture alert, his attention fixed not on any person in the room, but on the floor near the edge of the fireplace. He moved toward it with deliberate steps, his nose lowering as he sniffed along the wooden boards, his movements precise, searching. Daniel followed him instinctively, the tension in his chest tightening again. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Max did not respond. Instead, he stopped at a specific point, his paw lifting slightly as he pressed against one of the boards. A dull, hollow sound echoed faintly beneath the pressure. Daniel crouched down slowly, his hand moving over the floor, feeling the difference in texture, the slight shift in the wood that would have gone unnoticed under normal circumstances. "That wasn't there before," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Helen had risen from her chair, her movements careful but purposeful, her eyes fixed on Daniel. Michael stepped forward slightly, his expression tightening again. "What are you doing?" he asked, but his voice lacked the firmness it had earlier. Daniel ignored him, his fingers tracing along the edge of the board until he found the small gap where it had loosened over time. He pressed down, then lifted gently. The board shifted with a soft creak, revealing a dark space beneath. The air seemed to still again. Max stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the opening. Daniel reached inside slowly, his hand brushing against something solid, a small box older than the one Helen had carried, its surface rougher, less preserved, as if it had been hidden away rather than carried through years. He pulled it out carefully, dust clinging lightly to its edges, and set it on the floor in front of him. Helen took a step closer, her breath catching almost
I had
imperceptibly.
to.
Daniel looked
Here's
up at her
his,
briefly,
Daniel.
then back at the
Thought you
box.
should have it.
This was his,
Helen. I'll
he
take
said
it.
quietly, not needing confirmation. Michael shifted again,
back to Helen.
unease
No,
clear in
it's
his
yours now,
posture.
Daniel.
Laura
I think
remained
it was always meant
silent,
to be yours.
but her attention now fully
Inside
locked
is
on the
safer
object. Daniel opened the box slowly, the lid lifting with a faint
I
resistance.
don't know if I can.
Inside, the contents were simple, but unmistakably intentional. A single folded letter, placed carefully, preserved despite the years it had been hidden. Daniel reached for it, his fingers steady, though his chest tightened slightly as he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was familiar, not perfectly remembered, but enough to recognize Robert Carter, his
I
father.
needed to bring him home.
Daniel's eyes moved across the first
Waiting for
line,
us, Helen.
then
I
stopped,
hope so,
the
Hans.
words settling into
I
place
hope
with a
so.
clarity that felt almost unreal. If Helen Brooks ever finds her way back here, Daniel read aloud, his voice quieter than before, the room falling completely silent around him. Helen stood very still, her hands clasped together, her eyes fixed on him. Daniel continued, his voice steady, but carrying a depth he had not expected.
You shouldn't be out here.
Tell her I
alone.
never forgot.
I know.
Not the night,
I know.
not the promise, and not the life we brought back.
I wish
His
I could say
breath
something
slowed as he
that
reached the
better.
end. The letter simple, but complete,
He would have
in a way
loved this
that
view.
needed no further explanation. Daniel lowered the paper slightly, his gaze lifting to Helen, whose eyes now shimmered faintly with something that had been held back for far too long. Max remained still beside them, his presence quiet but unwavering, as if he had known
rest
this
for a
moment was waiting beneath the surface all
Look out,
along.
Max.
Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of everything settling into something clear, something undeniable. His father had known, had prepared for this, had left something behind not just as memory, but as a message, a connection that had outlasted time. Helen took a small step forward, her voice soft but steady. He remembered, she said, not as a question, but as a truth finally confirmed. Daniel nodded once, his grip on the letter firm but careful. The silence that followed no longer uncertain, but full, as if something unfinished had finally found its way back to where it belonged. Morning came softly over the Colorado mountains, the light warmer than it had been in days, slipping through the tall pines and settling gently against the cabin windows.
Max.
Inside, the air felt different. Not simply because of the fire that had burned through the night, but because something unspoken had shifted, something that turned the space from a place of memory into something alive again. Daniel Carter stood near the window,
Always laughing.
his posture
just like
relaxed
you.
in a way it had not been since his return, his shoulders no longer carrying the same quiet weight that had followed him from the moment he left the service. Max lay stretched out on the floor between the living room and the kitchen, his body calm, his breathing slow, though his ears still twitched occasionally at the sounds of the forest outside. Helen Brooks sat at the table, the morning light resting across her face, softening the lines of age without hiding them. She looked not younger, but lighter, as if something long unfinished had finally settled into place within her. The wooden box rested beside her, now closed, no longer held tightly, but kept near out of habit rather than necessity. Daniel turned slightly toward her, a faint smile forming, not forced, not practiced, but real. "Did you sleep all right?" he asked.
Who is it?
Helen nodded gently.
Intruder.
"Better than I have in a long time," she replied, her voice calm, carrying a quiet sense of rest that had been missing before.
Alert! Stay ready.
Daniel stepped closer, leaning lightly
worry,
against the
Max.
table,
He's here.
his gaze drifting briefly toward the letter that now lay folded neatly beside the box.
But I couldn't just
"I think he
leave.
would have been glad you came," he said. Helen's eyes softened. "I think he knew I would," she answered, and for the first time, the words no longer felt like hope, but truth.
I knew you'd come.
Max rose slowly and moved between them, his body brushing lightly against both, as if connecting the space they shared. Daniel rested a hand briefly on the dog's head, his fingers pressing into the thick fur, grounding himself in the moment. Outside, the sound of tires crunching over snow broke the quiet. Daniel's head lifted instinctively. Max's ears snapped forward, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert. In an instant, Daniel stepped toward the window, his eyes narrowing slightly as he saw the same gray SUV pulling slowly into view once more. He exhaled quietly, not with tension this time, but with something closer to expectation. "They're back," he said. Helen remained seated, though her hands folded lightly together, her expression calm, not fearful. The door opened a few moments later, and Michael Brooks stepped inside, alone this time. His posture different from before, less rigid, his shoulders slightly lowered, as if whatever certainty he had carried earlier had been worn down by thought. He removed his coat slowly, his movements hesitant, his eyes moving first to Helen, then to Daniel, then briefly to Max, who stood still but watchful. No growl this time, only quiet attention. Michael cleared his throat, his voice softer than before. "I wanted to come back," he said, the words simple, but carrying weight. Daniel did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to settle. Michael continued. "I didn't handle things right," he admitted, his gaze lowering briefly. "I thought I was doing what made sense, what was practical." He paused, then added more quietly, "But I didn't stop to think about what mattered." Helen watched him, her expression steady, not cold, but not immediately forgiving either. Michael took a step closer, his hands resting awkwardly at his sides. "I shouldn't have left you there," he said, his voice tightening slightly, "and I shouldn't have tried to decide everything for you." Helen remained silent for a moment, then spoke gently. "You were trying to take care of things," she said, "but you forgot to take care of people." Michael nodded faintly, the truth settling into him without resistance. Daniel observed quietly, then stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "You don't fix something like that all at once," he said. Michael looked at him, listening. Daniel continued, "But you start by showing up." Michael nodded again, more firmly this time. Helen's gaze softened just slightly, enough to show that something had shifted. Not completely resolved, but moving in the right direction. Max moved forward slowly, his posture relaxed. He approached Michael cautiously, then stopped just within reach, watching him, waiting. Michael hesitated, then slowly lowered his hand, allowing the dog to sniff it. Max remained still for a moment, then gave a small, approving movement of his head before stepping back. The gesture subtle, but clear. Daniel noticed it immediately, a faint smile touching his expression. "He doesn't do that for just anyone," he said quietly. Michael exhaled softly. "I'll take that as a start," he replied. The tension in the room eased further, not gone, but softened into something manageable, something real. Later, as the afternoon stretched into evening, the cabin felt fuller, not because of noise, but because of presence. Helen moved through the space with quiet familiarity, no longer hesitant. Daniel found himself following routines he had not used in years, preparing meals, adjusting the fire, opening windows briefly to let in the crisp mountain air. Max moved easily between them, no longer choosing sides, but simply existing as the steady connection that had first brought them together. And as the light began to fade once more, Daniel placed a chair near the table, slightly apart from the others, not out of necessity, but intention. Helen noticed it immediately, her eyes resting on it for a moment longer than the others. "For guests?" she asked softly. Daniel shook his head, a faint smile forming. "For anyone who finds their way here," he said. Helen nodded gently, understanding without needing further explanation. The fire crackled softly as night settled again, but this time the cabin did not feel quiet in the same way it had before. It felt complete. Daniel stood for a moment, looking around the room, at Helen, at Max, at the chair left open, and for the first time since he had returned, he realized something simple and undeniable. He had not been lost, not truly. He had just been waiting for something, or someone, to give meaning to the place he had come back to. And now, standing there, he understood that what had been empty was no longer empty, and what had once been just a cabin had finally become a home. Sometimes, the miracles we are waiting for do not arrive with noise or light, but quietly, through people crossing our path at the exact moment we need them most. And perhaps that is how God works, not by changing the world all at once, but by placing the right souls into our lives to heal what we thought could never be restored, reminding us that no act of kindness is ever lost, no promise is ever forgotten, and no heart is ever too far gone to find its way back home. So, if this story touched you even in the smallest way, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part stayed with you. And subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you stories that remind us of faith, love, and second chances. And wherever you are in your life right now, may God watch over you, guide your steps, and bring peace to your heart.